Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. After a long time, I have with me Professor Dipankar Sengupta from the University of Jammu, a well-renowned commentator on various geopolitical issues. Yes, but of course, my focus is going to be the Chinese economy from him today. Sir, Namaskar. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much, Adi. Thank you for having me on this show.
It's a pleasure always, sir. Sir, I want to ask you to begin with. I was cracking a joke right before we started. There are two schools of thought with regards to Chinese economy. One says Chinese economy is dump, and analysts like Peter Zion and all that from the Americans say he's got 10 years left. That's just about it. And there's another school of thought that says, you know what, they still have some stuff in them. It'll take time. They're on the downfall, but don't write them off at the moment. Where do you stand, sir?
I would say don't write them off at the moment, but that is not to cast any seriousness on the serious issues that the Chinese economy faces. Look, the problem with China is it is not yet a fully developed economy. Their per capita income standards and livings are still lower than Europe and the United States. The problem is one would have thought it still had some steam left, before it got to that particular point. They are showing problems of stagnation, stagnating growth, even before they have actually reached or
That
even
point.
are close to reaching those levels of income. That is the worrisome part. Having said that, the fact remains that nobody dies of starvation in China any longer. While inequality is very, very high, if you had a reasonable redistribution of income, everybody would lead comfortable lives. That's an if. If that if doesn't work, they are far ahead of India, but the problems that one would have associated with a advanced aging economy has already caught up with China. And that is a serious problem that the Chinese policymakers have to tackle. And except for one part, I don't think they're any closer to starting to tackle the other part, which is the part they're tackling: automation. See, one of the structural problems of the Chinese economy, and I thank the World Bank economist Lant Pritchett, who pointed this out about 20 years ago in a seminar, that one child, one policy norm that they adopted in 1979 is now coming back to bite them in the backsides. You know what it means after some time is two persons are retiring from the economy, father and mother both working. Who is entering the economy? Their offspring, who is one in number. So labor force shrinks, adding to a labor shortage. Now that they're taking care of by automating and so on and so forth. The other problem, you have a large pension bill because all these old people, in a sense, have to be taken care of, and their absolute numbers as well as share of population is growing, and they have to be maintained by a shrinking supply of workers. So it is going to create a severe dent in the supply of savings. They won't be able to, they no longer are that kind of prodigious savers that they used to be. This has a consequence. Apart from the other structural problems that the Chinese economy faces, this has a consequence. And these problems are coming to head, it appears, one after the other. And that is why people who look at the Chinese economy are turning gloomy.
You've mentioned something very interesting, which a lot of people are kind of resonating with and saying that, it's not end game because a lot of countries who realize that China is going to fall, they're saying, okay, let's give in our last orders and let's give them in bulk so that by the time we build up our own infrastructure, we can take into consideration whatever China is giving us right now. And fair enough, it does show a certain growth in China that doesn't really matter. But these are gap fillings that a lot of countries are doing in order to kind of move away the supply chain and the requisite amounts that are required to do that itself. So in a way, China is helping China's decline. That's another
Uh,
thought process. How would you kind of term it?
Look, the fact is the following: I'm not aware of bulk orders being given to China all of a sudden. The fact is, for some time now, you see many people are basically building alternative supply chains,
Yeah.
especially in critical things. And India, of course, is one part. You have the Taiwanese semiconductors now seriously looking at India to manufacture chips and all that sort of a thing, which is huge. But even when it comes to other items, slowly but surely there is a diversification. Now, one of the diversification was a natural process. Chinese labor grow more expensive, so you have Vietnam and Bangladesh taking up the lower end of that particular supply chain. But the other, especially what you see in semiconductors, this is a deliberate and strategic effort on part of the Western or the developed world, I would say not necessarily the Western world, to ensure that their supply chains now for the future, in a sense, are assured should there be problems with the Chinese economy. But this is not to do with China's economic travails. This is also to do with China's economic behavior, where certain things like intellectual property rights are basically a plaything for them. They don't give a damn. They steal intellectual property, and having stolen intellectual property, they duplicate it and sell it to the rest of the world at a much cheaper price. Now, remember, this was a problem even 2 decades ago. This was a problem that Google and other IT majors recognized. But for a long period of time, for some reason, they thought that the Chinese economy, if they're given a place at the table, WTO table, and share of the market, they would somehow behave more responsibly. And it's taken quite some time for them to realize that the behavioral change they expected of China has not come forth. And therefore, it is now they are looking at other suppliers, namely India, much, much later. Now, look, so when I hear about this talk about Bangladesh is not a genuine democracy, as if Pakistan is, it's so ridiculous. For a long time, you consorted with a dictatorship which is turning from bad to worse. And now, for you, Bangladesh is a dictatorship, is an authoritarian regime. This Western nonsense, Western self-delusion is something that has been hard to crack, but thanks to China itself, it is slowly but surely cracking.
The interesting part about what you've just brought about is basically a little what is commonly known as geoeconomics, but I find that term very funny because geo itself means economics. So, it's politics, the geological and the global politics will consider economics itself. But in any case, what the Pakistanis kind of like to say that हमको geopolitics से geoeconomics की तरफ जाना पड़ेगा. So fair enough, we'll give it to them. I want to ask you about China. Is the biggest thing that we see in China today is a certain amount of expenditure that they would have planned, considering their economy going up at about 5-7%, and they would have planned that expenditure, and we see that expenditure, they're shirking out of it. One of the biggest telltale signs was the BRI summit, wherein normally they talk about trillions of dollars and this and that. This time the figure was at about 150 billion. And secondly, the point that they didn't have their the third plenum meeting, which is supposed to be scheduled every November, to put out the figure for the next year, and the this thing. So how do you gauge the factor that the Chinese officially have stopped actually collecting data for a lot of things?
But that's been the Chinese way for a long period of time. Let us look at the BRI. You can fool certain people all the time, all the people for some time, but not all the people for all the time. So whoever they had to fool with BRI, they have fooled, and now their ability to fool on the basis of BRI is somewhat lessened. So they have understood that this particular trick is not going to work. So they are not on BRI any longer. When it comes to figures, the Chinese always have been reticent about figures. I mean, a few years ago, they did not publish their youth unemployment figures, which they used to. Now they have not published certain set of figures which show that the economy is possibly in worse shape than we thought it to be. Now, one of the reasons you must understand is the following. A few months ago, the older elements of the Chinese Communist Party, especially the ones who had retired, you know, they had their summit, they get together in one of these resorts. I think it's called Shongnan Hai. It's a
Bedai Ho,
sea
sir.
resort. Huh?
Bedai Ho. Bedai Ho.
Vedai, whatever. They had their meeting, and the message conveyed by that meeting by the party elders who were responsible for putting him into power was apparently not a good one. You know, and Xi Jinping was understandably angry. He said, "Look, I'm trying to figure out and sort the problems they have left me as a bequest. I, but the fact is, he's not being able to solve them. So these are problems, in a sense, bequeathed to him. Xi Jinping didn't create these problems. These are problems bequeathed to him by Hu Jintao, before that, Jiang Zemin, and the others. No doubt about it. Okay, he has been bequeathed problems, but he has also been bequeathed the largest export machine in the world ever. He has been bequeathed a massive industrial base. So there are pluses and there are minuses. But if you look at what he has been doing, he has actually used the infrastructure of the nation, the resources of the nation, and the power of the party to build a cult around himself. Xi Jinping thought. What is this Xi Jinping thought? He has not taken, at least he has not taken the route that was taken by Deng Xiaoping. He is no Deng Xiaoping, who finally took China out of the economic morass which Mao had left it in. So he has not been able to reform the Chinese economy, and they have given him a lot of leeway, a lot of rope. He has got the kind of power which very few people before him, Deng included, had. He has been given all power, all authority, and now time is running out. And these elders told him, "Look, this can't go on any longer." Now, what the elders told him, we don't know. We only can get information from third-party sources. People who know that these were the feedback of the elders that was given to him. So the fact is, he is in serious trouble. And if he is in serious trouble, he is unlikely to release the data which will get him deeper into trouble. Okay. I mean, it's not that the party elders don't know, but a mood in a sense is being built up, it appears, which is going against him. And that is why you will see this reticence on part of the Chinese to release sensitive data. Unless they have somewhat of a turnaround, don't expect too much data from the Chinese government, especially with respect to unemployment figures, growth figures, and so on and so forth. Remember, what is new is a lot of those, in India what we call them parinde bazes. Parinde baz have come up who are actually encouraging illegal immigration of Chinese to America and Europe. I mean, this in a sense was unheard of. You never found a Chinese person who's trained lacking a job. But somewhere down the line, some change has taken place where these people find no takers for their skills, and in large number of them are migrating illegally to the United States. So that's a serious problem.
That's, I mean, there's a lot of that happening actually when you see the videos of the southern border in Texas and all that. I mean, they caught like what 30-40 Chinese people in one row, and they were asking where you from and all that. So there's that happening. So, but China, one of the faults of the Chinese economy, and please correct me if I go wrong in this analysis, is that when they took over the manufacturing for the West, back in the 80s and 90s, one of the things that the West also did was they kept the R&D with them, and then actually just gave them, I won't say really low tech, but just the tech to produce. They didn't give them the tech to research, which is where Chinese actually go out and steal stuff because they want to know how it is done. Uh, how do you see that impacting the Chinese economy today?
Okay. Adi, let's be frank. As the West grew richer and wage rates started to rise, it was only normal, and trade theory also tells us that the low end of the manufacturing, which is labor intensive, will travel to those places where labor is cheap. And this was true for the 80s, 90s, even the early 2000s. After some time, the actual wealth is in intellectual property. A human resource rich country, actually rich in human resources, that is in knowledge and technology, their basic asset is essentially technology. Now, this
Hmm.
technology could be embedded into a machine or it could be embedded into a design. Okay. It is the design that is all important, and the design that is the fruit of hard work and study. That has to be protected. If you don't protect that, if you don't reward that, people will not go into R&D as it easily. Initially, R&D happened to be embedded in machines. So I could give a blueprint of a Boeing 747, say to Ivory Coast, they would not be able to reproduce it. But that is not true vis-a-vis China, say for the latest semiconductor chip. If they have the designs, they'll be able to produce it. So the question is, it is protected by copyright. And the Chinese, if they try to export this to a third country, the inventor of that particular chip will take action and that will be prohibited.
Hmm.
But the fact remains, the Chinese have been catching up, they have been coming up with technologies of their own. But at the end of the day, all new technologies, the path breaking technologies, still come from the West. The Japanese earlier would add on to these technologies, change them, adapt them, and make them market savvy. And the
Hmm.
Japanese did a fantastic job at it. Many of these, except for the light emitting diode, the Japanese have not actually invented anything. They have taken Western designs, which were clunky, the West was not working on it. With typical Japanese diligence, they worked upon it and got models that not only worked, but they were also error free. That is, in essence, the basis of the Japanese miracle. The Chinese are trying to do the same thing, except they're trying not to hitting at the Europeans and the Americans at a time when intellectual property is the most important thing that the Europeans and the Americans possess. Okay, that is something that the Europeans and the Americans will not let go of all that easily. So it's not as if the Americans prevented the Chinese from doing R&D. Actually, the Americans are pretty open when it comes to collaboration. But there are certain rules that you have to follow. That is, if you invent something, we will accept it as yours. Reciprocation demands that you also accept that if I invent something, you have to respect that it is mine. And you cannot use it without my permission, without paying the requisite fees that need to be paid. So it's not that they were prevented it from doing anything. I mean, if you have the resources, you train your manpower and you do research. And the number of collaborative research that Chinese scientists have done with Western universities is
It's
mind blowing.
massive. Hmm.
So who on the earth stopped this flow of knowledge into China? Nobody. But the thing is intellectual property rights. If I invent something, you have to respect that I invented it, and you can't clone it without my permission and without paying the requisite fees. This is not too hard to understand. This is India, something scrupulously has agreed to ever since 2004, when the transition period of the WTO ended. Once we said, okay, we are going to accept product patents, India has scrupulously abided by it. Otherwise, India is very good at duplicating medicines and selling to the rest of the world. We did not do so after 2004. But the Chinese, unfortunately, have not been very honest in that particular aspect. India has scrupulously honored all its commitments with respect to intellectual property ever since 2004, when the transition phase of the WTO ended. We were given 10 years from 94 onwards to bring our laws and systems in consonance with WTO laws. After 2004, all our laws and our practices are WTO consistent. Chinese laws may be WTO consistent, but their practices are not. They still practice protectionism, and they are gross violators of IPR regimes.
I mean, the problem with the Chinese is that obviously they don't kind of respect the IPR and this and that. But one of the biggest things that we see, which is coming out of China today and the US itself, is that they are catching them on these IPR, this thing, and they're catching them on the supply chain, which would help the Chinese take the IPR that they've stolen to the next level. So that obviously is a big dent, considering the factor that you mentioned Chinese are trying to replace the demographic issue with technology by automation. So how do you kind of see the connect here? Because as a manufacturing economy, if there is a single link which breaks in the supply chain, you've got a major issue on your hand.
Look, two things. If the West is consistent when it comes to handling China's IPR violations, it's one thing. On the other hand, suppose you, for a temporary period of time, block access to a certain technology. The Chinese have enough resources and intelligence to throw money into it and find a solution. So, the denial of technology is a short-term thing. It's a short-term issue. Unless you systematically deny them technology and refuse to buy from them or deal with them when it comes to these particular technologies which are high paying and are of interest to your economy, till such a time you will not be able to stop the Chinese juggernaut from keeping on stealing your technology. These momentary measures against China will not work. In the short run, they will spur them on to overcome this particular technology gap. Right now, the technology gap between the People's Republic and the West isn't that much. Okay. And let us see, when I say West, it is basically the United States. You have
Hmm.
certain technological poles in Europe, say France for certain fields, Germany for certain fields, the Dutch for certain fields, the Brits for certain fields. But still, the technopole of the world is the United States. The Chinese are not far behind in many of the important areas when it comes to the United States. Now, what is the practice that the United States should follow? Is it a systematic denial of these technologies and access to these technologies alone, or refuse access to Chinese goods peddling the same technologies into your markets? Two things. Unless you do the latter also, then the first will not work.
That's the key point, right?
That's the key point.
Yeah. So as far as economic figures are concerned, when you look at the Chinese outputs that they give, they talked about their FDI, and that is very concerning. Is that the first time the FDI has gone into minus? That means there's more money leaving China than coming in, and especially that
Uh,
thing has been seen in 2023. Uh, Comment, sir.
Look, there is a time after which an economy, if it goes a particular level, it becomes a net exporter of FDI. You know,
Hmm.
your companies establish beachheads in the rest of the world and start to sell. And to a great extent, I suspect Chinese companies, to prevent Western retaliatory action or protectionism by other countries, in a sense, are setting up beachhead companies in these particular markets to take advantage of those markets. Because if you produce in those countries, the tariffs will not hurt you, because national treatment under WTO means that the Chinese factory or a Chinese investor in India producing for the Indian market has to be given the same treatment as an Indian producer.
Hmm.
This is what WTO says. So I am not surprised that there would be one day there would be a net outflow of investment from China. Okay. But the fact also remains that foreign companies who want to do business in China find the going extremely tough. I mean, see, one of the areas where the rest of the world had advantage was automobiles. But then the Chinese put in, conditions that you want to sell automobiles into China, you have to enter into a collaboration with a Chinese company, 49% and all that sort of a thing. Those are the deals under which they were allowed entry into the WTO. They negotiated entry into the WTO. So You want to sell to China, you find yourself handing over crucial technology to the Chinese, or you find yourself blocked. So, under those circumstances, it is clear that the Chinese market becomes very difficult to crack for outsiders, crack profitably. So, after some time, it's not surprising that FDI should dry up. There was a time the Chinese economy, you got a lot of FDI, and especially the non-resident Chinese were eager to invest because they wanted to use cheap Chinese labor to export to the rest of the world. So
Hmm.
China was a production site. Okay. Now the Chinese are such entrenched exporters that export prospects or growth of export prospects of China to the rest of the world are somewhat limited. Okay. So to use China as an export site has lost its attraction. To use China, invest in China to crack the Chinese domestic market is not profitable. So I am not surprised that FDI into China, in a sense, should dry up. I'm not
Hmm.
surprised. It had to happen one day. By design, the Chinese have made it earlier rather than later.
So let's now. I mean, we've kind of gone through the. I won't say I'm a big economist, but we've gone through a basic economic outlook of China today. Now let's look at the impacts, and I want you to kind of comment on that because the I won't say downfall, but I would say the regression of the Chinese economy would have an impact on its uh, positioning and its ability to do stuff in the world. So let's talk about that first. How do you see that changing going forward? Would the Chinese be as risk taking or risk averse?
Look, when it comes to economic strategies, okay, uh, this particular regime, the Hu Jintao regime, in a sense, has done nothing to reverse the problems that are being faced by the Chinese economy. Let us face it, the person to do something major was Deng Xiaoping. Now, how much circumstances pitched in, how much Deng was responsible is another matter altogether. But the opening up of the Chinese economy,
Hmm.
making it more, its marketization is Deng's legacy. And to a military clout, he gave it the economic clout to make it very, very powerful. Xi Jinping has been the recipient of this particular bequest. Now, he has not done anything risky or anything difficult on the economic front. But he has done several things on the geopolitical front to magnify Chinese power, which invariably has backfired. If you look at what he tried to do vis-a-vis India, India has become very hostile on a number of issues. And if you see the BRI failing sooner than later, then I think India has to be given some credit for it. Secondly, increasingly, major economies and democracies are looking at India as a more responsible partner to deal with rather than China. Make no mistake, Chinese economic clout is still very, very high. The West is so enmeshed in China, not necessarily because China is a large economy, but its supply chains are so integral to their economies, they can't mess around with China. But China also cannot mess around with them in that sense. To hit those supply chains would be a defeat for both of them. Now, the fact remains China has lost the trust that Deng Xiaoping gained by his behavior. When he opened up, he, let us face it, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, by and large, China behaved well internationally. Okay. So, I would say he behaved responsibly internationally. And as a result of which, he was able to gain some goodwill, he was able to gain some trust. Now, he personally would go and meet other meetings. That was, of course, a far less powerful China. He would go talk to people. He tried to settle Chinese differences with its neighbors and all that sort of thing. So the trust that China gained, he followed by Jiang Zemin, they gained the goodwill that they gained has been squandered by Jiang Zemin. Has been squandered by Xi Jinping, and I would say rather uselessly. I mean, what has he got? What has he got in reward for squandering these particular gains? All his gambles he has lost. But let us ask ourselves: even if he had won those gambits, what would he have gained? Precious little.
Precious
So
little.
it is this foolishness that he finds he has put the Chinese on the back foot much earlier than the Chinese would have been. You see, let's face it. What you see Chinese saber rattling with India or with Taiwan and the other countries is something that they had kept below the surface strategically, hoping for the day they would get more powerful. We are lucky that this foolish man has exposed these designs before China got more powerful. And in so doing, he has squandered the goodwill of practically everybody, you know, except the Russians, who the Europeans and the Americans have foolishly pushed into the arms of China. This is a point that Vivek Ramaswamy keeps on making over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that Western blunder is so blatantly true that the American deep state has taken it up for itself to ensure that nobody sees the truth. What does one do?
That's insightful. That's an insightful answer, sir, I must say. And coming, towards the close of the interview, I want to ask you, you've told us what is the power of China, which is left behind, and how foolish Xi Jinping himself has been. But that also leaves behind a certain opportunity of leverage that the Chinese have been creating economically around in the neighborhood.
Hmm.
And I want to come back down into the Indian neighborhood. We've seen an incident with the Maldives where the Chinese own about 20% of their debt. We see the Pakistanis kind of bidding for the Chinese, who own, I'd say, about 35-40% of their debt. So there's that factor which can actually, and I want to focus this on us, which can actually land us up into a lot of problems, because we can't. Let's be fair, we can't just pay off. Although Maldives is a small amount, about 1.3, 1.4 billion. Pakistan is about 35-40 billion. We just bailed out Sri Lanka. We just can't keep doing that. So is it the
Nor should
factor?
we.
Yeah. So, I
We
mean,
should not.
I sometimes really wonder that is China doing this purposefully within our neighborhood, like bankrupting these guys and waiting for us to
Look,
bail them out.
bankrupting Pakistan doesn't matter because
Yeah,
Pakistan
I
would have
mean,
bankrupted itself anyway.
yeah,
As
that's
an
an
economic
irrelevant
player,
country.
Pakistan is at best an irritant. It can't do
Yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah.
When it comes to the Maldives, look, Maldives' internal politics, in my opinion, it is internal politics in a sense that has led to India out, China in, and all that sort of a thing. Very soon, the present administration will come to realize that India is a far more benign neighbor and a far more benign partner than the Chinese are. They will realize it. Not yet, but they will realize it. Let us hope, for the sake of Maldives, it is not too late for them, that they would have incurred the kind of debt which they would find impossible to pay back. But there are certain things you can do, and there are certain things you have to leave to the wisdom of your neighbors. All said and done, the Bangladeshis may cozy up to China, but fiscally they are conservative and they will not take on any liability which they can't pay back. Hmm. Whereas the Pakistanis are absolutely reckless. They've actually given up. They've actually given up on their finances. They will basically live a hand to mouth existence from loan to loan, taking whatever scraps are thrown their way. And ultimately, don't be surprised if the Pakistanis refuse to pay back their loans. I mean, if they tell the Chinese, we are not going to pay back your loans, and then tell the Americans, from now I will be your faithful servant, the Yanks, in all likelihood, will forget what Pakistan has done and will let the Pakistanis come back into the cold. Okay. What the Chinese will do, I'm not too sure. The border they share is a very small border, so they can't beat up the Pakistanis. Number one. Number two, they only export to Pakistan, they receive no imports from Pakistan, so they can't denying Pakistan any markets. And as for supplying Pakistan, there are other alternatives Pakistan has available. So watch this space. I'm waiting for the Pakistanis to default on the Chinese debt or the Chinese liabilities very soon. See what happens then. Hmm. So that's so the thing is, our biggest advantage in our neighborhood has not necessarily been our policies vis-a-vis the neighborhood. I think we are less agile than what we should be. It is the imprint and the debris left behind by the Chinese that, in a sense, have helped us. Not just in our neighborhood, but also in will help us in countries like Africa, Latin America, and so on. So I
Hmm.
wish we could make our game smarter. You know, we could be far more forthright. We should, we should allow access for these countries into our countries when it comes to trade. You know, in return for access, we should do it. We have to build up manufacturing clout. I wish we were far more adept and on the game than we are now. But our policy vis-a-vis countries that are less developed than us has not been rapacious.
Hmm.
Chinese policies have been. And that is why, in the longer run, the Chinese, in a sense, are losing out.
That's interesting. Lastly, sir, what do you see? How? I mean, we said not to write the Chinese economy off. Fair enough. Some people say 10 years. How long will you give it? Because
Look,
Chinese, as per the system, and might I take 10 seconds more? As if you look at their history, uh, none of the kingdoms have lasted more than 100 years. So they're coming close to that point again. And they have that, they have this thing of actually infighting, and then they go into turmoil, and then they reset, and then they come back, and this and that. So how long do you give them? Because internal expenditures are going up for Xi Jinping.
hmm,
COVID, security, internal security. I'm not talking about external security. External as well, there's a huge defense budget and stuff like that. His
hmm,
expenditures are internally rising. And no, we've not even spoken about the internal debt. So how
hmm.
long do you give China?
Look, I mean, 10 years is a very short period of time.
Yeah, it is. Mm.
Now, what has happened is Xi Jinping, in a sense, took away that bar upon himself. You know, there's no bar on Xi Jinping. It was on the
Mm.
others, but not on him. I believe that his next term will not be 10 years if he does get a next term. Let us see what the elders say, because the elders will say certain things. If the Chinese economy is able to reform, it will keep on growing, not at those breathtaking 9% and 20% rates of growth, at a smaller pace of growth. But those reforms are difficult. One is you have to do away with the one child policy norm, which they are relaxing. My problem is the following, that a lot of this, there's a momentum. When a society for 4 to 5 decades becomes used to a one child policy norm for a variety of reasons, less trouble and that sort of thing, then getting the people to produce a second child can become extremely difficult. I mean, look at countries like Italy and Japan. They didn't have a forcible one child norm. But once a one child norm sets in, people are reluctant to have less children, then you get an aging population very, very fast. And that is something it's not easy to get out of. In any case, you start producing two children today, they will only enter the workforce 20 years hence. But the fact remains that that is a long term solution. That has to be part of the long term solution. Secondly, they have to build up their internal markets. Look, the Chinese market economy is not much of a market economy. After some time, the Chinese have now realized that the real estate economy is a hot one, a speculative one, and they are doing stuff to basically bring it down. But the other things that the Japanese did, income doubling plans, how do
Mm.
you increase disposable income so that people are able to buy more goods, especially high-end technological goods? I don't think the Chinese have started at all. There is, see, For this, you have to have open discussions about what to do. When did you last hear any discussion on what the Chinese need to do? You had far more public discussions during Deng Xiaoping's time. Indeed, all the way till Hu Jintao's time. Now it's not there.
It used
I
to be
don't want.
collective leadership. Yes,
It
correct,
used
sir.
to be collective leadership, number one. And, at one level, at the intellectual level, people said a lot of things. People said a lot of things. I was in Beijing in, I think, 2005. Okay. The stuff you got to hear in restaurants, talking with other professors, etc., was mind blowing.
Mhm.
They were telling you stuff which we tell about our leaders. You know, there was free discussions. You had think tanks that would promote free market ideas. There was Unirule Institute that would promote free market ideas. All of them have been told to shut down shop.
Yep.
See, if you don't keep your critics near, you're not going to get new ideas. That is a problem that authoritarian regimes face. That when problems start piling up, the canary in the mine does not sing until it is very late. And that is what the Chinese are facing. There has been criticism about Xi Jinping. The critics have been silenced. Okay, you think you have a solution to all the problems, solve it. As of now, the Chinese have done nothing, very little actually, to start solving the problems. If people start, look, let's face it, it has a massive foreign currency reserves, it has a manufacturing base. At least artificially, they will be able to stimulate the economy for quite some time.
Hmm.
But so did Japan for quite some time.
And
It
then it
is,
fell.
and then
Hmm.
it fell or stagnated. This is what the Chinese will have to do. It will have to basically think about reforming their economies, especially now they are doing something about the real estate markets, but the income doubling plans kind of things that the Japanese did to promote internal consumption and growth, that is something that they're not doing yet. That is something they're not doing yet, and that will have problems.
So you don't see the effort of a correction. That is obviously a big challenge.
I don't see any effort of correction. No, no major effort of correction.
The problem is that, sir, and just to conclude, I don't see Xi Jinping as a receptive leader. I don't see him kind of asking for feedback, saying, "Okay, we did this. क्या हो गया यार? कुछ ठीक हुआ? कुछ गड़बड़ है? क्या हो गया? What is the feedback and this and that?" I think he's become a person that, boss, I've told you, get it done. I don't care. And
Look,
people are now scared of coming back to him and telling him, "Saab, thoda गड़बड़ हो गया है."
okay,
You know?
when I think about Xi Jinping, that joke comes to mind. Ki, somebody says, there's a newspaper report today that says, her wife's telling the husband that if you drink too much, you'll get sick. So he says, मैं कल से बंद कर दूंगा. And कल आता है, newspaper बंद कर देता है. Now, Xi Jinping's father was a victim of the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
You should have thought that would have given lessons to Xi Jinping not to institute a similar kind of a regime. He doesn't send people to labor camps, etc. He has a different way of managing it. But what he has chosen to see, he saw his father and therefore decided that rather than be a victim like my father, I will be a torturer like Mao Zedong. So I will be among the guys who wield the stick rather than work towards reforming the system.
Hmm.
And so he has stopped the newspaper. वो अखबार बंद कर दिया है. That is his problem. One would have thought that as a victim of the Cultural Revolution, he would have realized what the problems of the parties were. But he has chosen to take on the role of the Red Guard rather than reform the party itself. And that is a tragedy. And that is, look, it's not a Xi Jinping problem. It's a general problem of communist parties. The inability to reform is very high. And whereas Deng actually saw destruction taking before his place and he basically lifted it up, these people think that the prosperity that we have earned will stay with us forever. We can live with this level of prosperity. We don't really want more. Now is the time to flex our muscles. They got the timing right. They got their neighbors wrong. Sorry, they got the timing wrong. They got their neighbors wrong also. There has been a pushback from the from likely as well as unlikely sources, and they find themselves timid and humiliated.
On that note, sir, thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking to you, and I hope the next time we speak is not after this long a gap.
No, no,
On
no.
that, thank you so much for your time and explanation. Jai Hind, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.